start with this. So design principles are the fundamental concepts that guide our design choices. As design is such a broad and all-encompassing activity, we can't specify all the types of challenges and questions that we may be presented with. What we can do, though, is create a set of general principles that will guide us in our design decisions. These principles should derive from the nature of the system we're designing. They should be aligned with what we consider as good design and good outcomes. Complex systems are fundamentally different from simpler systems. Thus, just as we have a whole new area of science based upon new principles to understand them, the whole complexity science thing requires new thinking to be able to understand complex systems. That's going to be the same for design. If we're trying to design complex systems, we're going to need very different ideas and principles. So systems design requires a new set of design principles that are aligned with these basic characteristics and dynamics of complex systems. So that's the idea of principles, that they should point us and guide us in the direction of what we consider good design. And as mentioned, this can be very different when we're dealing with complex systems. So I'm not sure how familiar we are with this idea of a complex system. They're very different from simpler systems. Simpler systems, they have few parts, low interdependence, relatively isolated components, relatively static, and so on. Complex systems, many parts, highly interconnected, highly interdependent, adaptive, and evolutionary. And this creates a very different kind of context within which we're designing. So some of those complex systems, there may be a smart city would be a very good example of a complex system. Organizations, enterprise design, trying to design organizations, urban design for the smart city, Internet of Things, software systems, the example of designing complex systems, supply chain design, information system design, transport systems are well-known complex systems. So these are the kind of things we're trying to design. We're not designing simpler systems, you know, chairs and cups or whatever. These are highly complex systems. We're going to need some new kind of design principles because they operate in quite different ways to a chair or a table or something like this. And these are some of the characteristics of complex systems that you may be familiar with. They're open, they're not closed systems. You know, a chair is kind of a closed system. You can say where the boundary is. It's quite simple to get your hands around it. These sorts of things, they're not like that at all. Systems boundary is not clearly defined, but it's open. They're emergent. New patterns and dynamics emerge on different levels. They're kind of alive, right? Not like a chair, it's just sitting there. It's not going to jump up and run around. That's unlike an organization. An organization is alive and it's continuously creating new patterns and so forth. And this idea of emergence, and we need to kind of work. The idea is that we need principles that are going to work with these aspects. So adaptive parts have a high degree of autonomy, adaptive capacity, and they can evolve over time. Complex systems are multi-dimensional. This system is composed of diverse subsystems and it's multifunctional. They have this networked architecture to them, highly interconnected. The system is more like a network rather than just a set of components. And finally, self-organization, key aspect to complex systems of all kinds. Parts are not static and inert, but may adapt and self-organize over time. This is really going to change the kind of paradigm, right? When you're dealing with adaptive, self-organizing components relative to static ones, you're going to need new kind of design principles, and that's what these here are. What are the kind of principles? What are the kind of requirements, actually, that we're going to need when dealing with these kinds of systems? So holistic, we want a design approach that's holistic in consideration of all relevant factors, rather than partial. So it's open. We want to develop systems that are open, involving the contribution of the many, rather than closed to only the few. Integrated, we need systems that are connected, accessible, and integrated rather than siloed due to borders and boundaries. Evolving, design that works with the full life cycle to create systems that are circular, regenerative, and evolutionary rather than linear and degenerative. Kind of characteristic of many of the things we design around here. They don't evolve, they don't really adapt very much, and they're kind of degenerative in a certain sense. Come back 10 years later and the building you built won't look as good as when you first built it. But we know self-organizing living systems can adapt and evolve and regenerate themselves over time. How could we actually work with that? So decentralized does not concentrate inwards and create dependency upon centralized nodes, but pushes outwards, engaging the end user in the creation of the solution. So we talked quite a bit about many of these things before: user-generated systems, holism, networks, and so forth. Today we're going to explore these 8 different principles. So over the course of the next 2 or 3 sessions, we'll explore all of these here. Subcategories of those. Today we're just going to look at 2 of them. This first one, which is about holism. So we're going to talk about holism, integration, patterns, multidimensional, so on and so forth. We're going to look at these. And I now encourage you to join me on the Miro board, where I'm going to ask you to post up your stickies here. The first one we're talking about is a holistic approach. Some of the considerations there. Let me just quickly touch upon some of those. Systems thinking holistic in nature. So we're going to need a design approach that's kind of holistic, that's accounting for all the relevant parts. Integrated, as opposed to reductionism, that's breaking down and separating out into different parts. The systems paradigm looks at the world in terms of relationships and integration. And we need a design approach that's using that kind of paradigm. It's a pattern-based approach, and it's multi-dimensional. We've talked about a lot of these ideas in the past. I'm going to share this Miro board link with you now. Here it is in the chat, if you could join when you're ready. And take a look at this first board, and you'll see each of those things I just mentioned beside an image. And I want you to grab a sticky here, and I want you to post up the sticky, grab a sticky, whatever color you want. And let me set the right size. And take this idea here of holism, and I want you to tell me what you think that is about in the context of design. Or can you give me some examples? And use this image here to help spark your imagination and see what you come up with. What is holism as a principle? We're talking about design principles here. What does this mean, say, in the context of what we're looking at here? Cities. How can we design cities in a holistic way? We've talked a bit about this before. And you can choose your question here. There's 4 questions, right? Another one's about integration over here. Wow, we've got so many people joining us today. Our board is just packed. Integration. So this is about designing integrated systems. So take this image here and tell me, take that principle of integration and try to explain to me what that means in the context of designing complex systems. Do you have examples? What does it spark in your imagination? So there's 4 sets there. You can see down here also, patterned. It's a pattern-based approach to design. What do you think that means? And over in the corner here, multi-dimensional. Does not try to reduce down to one level, but deals with all dimensions to the system. What do you think that means in the context of designing complex systems? And you can use the image to spark your imagination. So there you go, guys. I'll share the link again for those newcomers. Please grab your sticky and don't be shy. Post up your thoughts, or maybe you have some experience with this design using these principles. Anything you'd like to share with us? You can choose all of those questions. You can reply to them, or one of them, or 2 of them, or as you wish. We're going to take maybe 5 minutes to do that before we read through some of them to start a discussion around it. Alrighty, let's jump in to start a discussion about some of this. You've been very active here. We've got over 50 people working on a Miro board here. I've never seen this kind of contribution before. So let's see, acknowledging awesomeness. I like it. Is green space accessible to all? Meta impact framework. What do you think this is about? Meta impact framework. Who is that? If you want to say a few words on this, you can unmute yourself and tell us what you're thinking.
It was me. Yeah, meta impact is a framework which where you basically get the help of multiple dimensions. Therefore, I put the same sticker down to the quadrant down left, down right, multi-dimensional, where you actually define the purpose of it all, and then you have like 10 capitals which all pay into the purpose you want to pursue, and you have like a framework which helps you to drive it towards the whole. Let's put it like this. It's based on the integral theory, and yeah.
Yeah, it's kind
I think for now it's fine. I could tell an hour or whatever.
Yeah.
We do some info sessions on those stuff. For those who know, it's good.
Very, very interesting. It's kind of looking at the outcome, or the kind of the metrics of the outcomes that you'd like to achieve, and trying to account for all the things that you care about and you think are important, and then working backwards to design a system that might create those different kind of outcomes and optimize across those different dimensions. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So you can look at it from both sides. On the one hand, you take the 10 capitals as resources which go into the, let's say, the production system which produces the outcome, the system, yeah. And at the same time, you can look at it as something you use for measuring your impacts in your environment. Yeah, so actually, you can also use the 10 capitals to think about how you interact with your environment and how you influence or impact it. So it's like in and out, and so we personally use it as an enterprise leading tool, right? To from an integral perspective, and based on integral theory, on a systemic view, not to build parts, but to use it as a tool to govern your own, to lead your own company.
Great. It's very holistic, isn't it? It's accounting, full cost accounting. You're accounting for everything. And you said 10 capitals. Is this like a framework that people use? I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it was invented by some professor, Sean Hasberg, and he did some research over years about all these, terms like human capital. I think everyone heard of, right? And then there are multiple of these capitals throughout the last 100 years, that have been explored, and he made this meta impact framework out of it. So he condensed this whole thing to 10 capitals, and he made a framework out of it where you can basically look at, let's say, personal perspectives for the inner self, some
great. Maybe for the sake of time, if you could post a link in the chat there, I'm sure people would be interested. Thank you very much.
I will post some links, and we do some info sessions on these as well on a monthly basis. So I will give you some links. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So purpose, users, personas, Benjamin Bratton diagram. Okay, that's this here. User interface, address, city, cloud, Earth. Okay, that's kind of a multi-dimensional layered perspective of it. Endeavoring to approach a wicked problem holistically can be a challenge if components can be seen in opposition if taken separately. Components may be seen as in opposition if taken separately. The donor economics social foundation and ecological ceiling are one example, but they can't be seen in terms of trade-offs. Okay, I think we've talked a lot about synergies in the past. It's maybe what you're getting at here. How can we, instead of environment versus economy, how can we design things that put them in a synergistic relation? I think that's a lot of actually what we're struggling with in our world. How do we design systems that turn dis-synergies, conflictual trade-offs, as you say, between economy and ecology into synergistic relations? Quite a challenge indeed. Look at footprints also. Okay, design and build everything within the context of the place. Anybody want to talk on this? A place-based approach. Choose education concepts based upon the people, children living there. Okay. Does some form of landscape assessment to understand first who and what are the parts of the system. Do some form of landscape assessment. Anybody want to talk on this one? In harmony with the overall system? One way of thinking about it, trying to design something that's in harmony with the environment, and you're talking about kind of place-based approaches here, something, design a system. It's kind of the problem we have, isn't it? We design these things here, not really in harmony with their environment. A lot of dis-synergies. So what else do you have? Seeing the bigger picture. Yep, that's kind of what it's all about. Being critical about the paradigm from which you're designing from. For where does a vision come? From where does a vision come? Who does it benefit? Who does it marginalize? Yeah, being reflexive about the paradigm for which we're designing from. Indeed, consider socio-technical ecological systems and their entanglement. Anybody want to talk on this? Who's the pink person? Or the purple person, I should say. A lot of complexity here, isn't there? I mean, think about that. That's part of why we don't do it, isn't it? Socio-technical, ecological systems, all intertwined, culture and values, and economics and money. Complex systems, indeed. Like this idea of thinking about time, history, and future, look deeply at the historical contingencies regarding of how we get here. Yeah, everything's in time and everything's in space, isn't it? That's one way of thinking about all this stuff. How does it play out in time, in space, in the context it exists in, and how is it played out over time? Nature as inspiration. Kind of biomimicry, biodesign approach. Who is leaving and who are the incomers? Bringing stakeholders to the design table that represent the diversity of the whole. Anybody want to talk on this? That's kind of difficult, isn't it? Getting everyone in the room, designing together. It's quite challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's just bringing that objective to the conversation at least moves you in the right direction. Being able to represent the entire diversity might be impossible, but kind of using the concept of a sample size that gets you closer to, rather than closing down the stakeholder group to those who are maybe have the availability or the ability to join, but actually opening it up broader than that.
Maybe it's like the way we do a kind of governance too, in the way that we have kind of broad democratic systems where people get to have some say in the system, and you have a legislator that's representing those people on general considerations, but then on specific ones we have an executive, isn't it? So maybe you have a design executive team, but then feeding into that is the considerations of all these broader people, seeing as they can't have all those people there all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. We think about this in terms of like advisory councils that represent a set of stakeholder groups, and it's their responsibility to sort of bring the perspectives of their broader group to the table. So rather than engaging with, you know, say for example, 1,000 organizations, you're engaging with a group of 30. It's their responsibility to represent the interests of their constituent groups and bring their considerations to the table.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of that probably happens in public sector stuff, but I guess a lot of you know, large corporations are designing the systems that run our world these days, and a lot of that, Apple and so forth, happens behind closed doors, doesn't it? We don't get a great input into that.
Yeah.
So who's leaving and who are the incomers? Everything is a part or a whole simultaneously. Holons, we talked about those before. Design with nature, promote human and natural flourishing, health in all policy approaches. Who is this?
Well, I'll take that one. I come from the public health sphere in this, and I'm so enjoying your webinars. Health in all policies is an approach, and an example would be the paradigm would be reducing health inequities in all policies. So the notion of horizontal and vertical kind of integration of policies, multi-sectoral collaboration in policies. One example is, has been worked on, I know in Canada and Australia, in transportation and accessible transportation. And you can start to imagine the links to the benefits of active transportation and access to public transportation. So I just thought that was a good example.
Yeah, because I mean, health is kind of part of everything, isn't it? I guess when you take a holistic approach, you start to see everything is interconnected, right? Everything is part of everything. Like health isn't the thing that happens in hospitals, and education isn't the thing that happens in schools. All these things are part of everything, really. That's the holistic concept. And then when you start to design from that, wow, it gets super complex, doesn't it? When you're designing your bus, you got to think about health and security and maybe education and whatever else and whatever else. So it's very challenging, isn't it? I think it's always good to consider that constraint. And that constraint of complexity, like how much complexity can we deal with? That's always going to be relative to like our understanding of complexity and our capacity to deal with it. But I think a lot of what we object to about these kind of systems we design, and they don't integrate and work with their environment, and we don't get these synergies, is just they're designed according to a limited number of factors because we couldn't really deal with all that complexity. And so it's this kind of, it's going to require upgrading our thinking, so system thinking stuff to even begin to deal with that complexity, and then maybe be able to design systems from that. Do you think we're going in that direction of integrating more complexity into our design? Do we think that's happening? Anybody want to talk on that? Or are we going in the opposite direction?
I think, if I may, I think we are talking and thinking a lot about that. I'm not sure if we are really moving as fast in the doing.
Challenging, all of this stuff, I'd say, for sure.
Yeah, I'm
okay.
Curious,
go on.
I'm curious about how we can avoid making things complicated. Like an engine might be very complicated, but not necessarily, or like a box of tools might be complicated, but not necessarily complex. And how we can move towards complexity rather than complication, which is like difficult to deal with. Whereas in a complex system, the pieces are interrelated and like co-evolutionary.
Yeah, and we've kind of touched upon this a little bit, right? This idea, I think we have Joanna with us. She could tell us a lot about it. Simple rules leading to, You know, that's one principle in complex systems. We don't try to specify the whole thing in all its details and all its rules and everything. You know, the way, if you look at our legal systems, right, incredibly complicated at this stage. All these rules about this and about that. Maybe there's a different way. Complexity theory would tell us that actually complex systems, they don't have to be the product of a complicated set of rules. They can emerge out of quite simple rules, and the interaction, the complexity comes from the interaction between those. And you just got to design a context, could be relatively simple, and some interactions, basic interactions, and out of that you can get a whole pile of complexity, like those bird flockings. I think financial markets are good examples too, actually. Like basic kind of algorithms that people are using to trade are quite simple, but out of that you get a whole pile of kind of complexity emerge out of the interactions. So part of it is the challenge of thinking like that, first thinking like that, and then figuring out how to design systems like that. We really haven't got there. And that would help us really harness complexity in a big way, I think. So this one here, integrated systems. Okay, not only the road, but also the little lakes are integrated. Hope this was designed for, and echo paths were made to connect them. Okay, don't forget about the little lakes, the little guys down here, the tadpoles and all the frogs and everything. I get you. Okay, so consider all the stakeholders, joining interactions, taking into account all kind of relationships. Anybody want to talk on that? Take into account all kind of relationships. Attention towards agreements as necessary ground for intentional integration. Anybody want to speak on this? What are the power dynamics at play when you decide what goes where? Yep.
Hey, Joss.
Hey, who's this?
Good to see you.
Hey, Sophia.
I'm hanging around, learning a little bit more about community. And I mentioned the agreement piece in relationship to that integration. And I put, there's something around agreements that are sometimes invisible, particularly amongst humans, like social norms, right? And even ways of thinking. So in order for an agreement or an integration to occur, even for example, the power dynamics, right? That there are conscious and unconscious agreements that we're all participating in. And if we can make those visible, then integration becomes a little easier. But without those, particularly amongst humans, it's really hard. So the subtlety of considering, that layer of agreements is a necessary foundation for that level of integration. That's what I meant.
Totally. And becoming aware of that and making it visible and then opening it up for design, saying it's okay to design these things, because in a lot of societies it's not okay to, like, you don't get to design your political system, do you, if you live in a dictatorship or something? So, and even in developed economies and democracies, there's a lot of things, as you say, that are still kind of subconscious and they aren't really surfaced, and we aren't able to design, we aren't yet actually able to design kind of institutions. A lot of our organizations, obviously haven't really been designed. It's just like someone came along and the highest paid person is up there at the top, and then, I think we know the way it is. They aren't actually designed the way we would really want them to be, or would give us the best kind of outcomes. So there's a whole sphere, I'd say, a whole dimension in our worlds, particularly around institutions, that we haven't really opened up. Legal systems, are they designed? They're not really designed. As you say, agreements between people, a lot of them aren't really designed. They just kind of evolved, and we aren't really fully conscious of them. And still, first becoming conscious of them first. Culture too. right? And a lot of social agreements. Okay, so dealing with constraints. Don't fight over others. Don't fight the other, but design an interface. Anybody want to speak on this? Equilibrium and diverse interests coming together. Equilibrium and diverse interests coming together. Anybody want to talk about that? It means to always consider the environment of your system of interest and consider those relationships essential to the state of your system as a whole. That's a good one. Who's this? Consider.
That would be me.
Yeah. Consider
Awesome.
the relationships necessary. Hey, John, consider all the relationships necessary to the state of your system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, we are limited human beings, right? So at some point you have to draw a line, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider what's on the other side of the line. It's always necessary to, like, even if you say, well, I'm going to design the healthcare system in a specific country, you can always still connect it to different systems that it's dependent on, or at least consider its most important connections to its environment. Not necessarily all of them, because then you would just make the system bigger, but to consider the most essential ones, the ones that play the most, like the biggest role in how your system behaves. It's valuable.
And you might even kind of be a bit humble and recognize the limitations of your intelligence and say, right, we know it's incredibly complex out there, but our finite brains and our capacities can only deal with this, but we're going to recognize the rest that we can't. And we're going to say that that still exists, even, at the moment, we don't really recognize the thing. We don't really talk about the unknown unknowns of things we don't know how to deal with. We just kind of pretend they don't exist. If we could just get as far as pretending or saying that they do exist, probably be a big step, wouldn't it? And then that would open us up to trying to bite off more complexity and at least recognize that, and that there would be uncertainty there and potential negative externalities and all sorts of things. Good point. So connections at small and large scale, kind of different levels to this system. Organizations don't break them up in functional silos. Yep. Starting from values. Anybody want to talk on that? Starting from values?
I can talk about that a little bit. If we can agree on a specific set of values that we want the city to function under. So I'm thinking about the example of like Curitiba, Brazil, where they started with, we're going to focus on designing with nature and serving the most vulnerable parts of the population, but that ended up making it better for everybody. And so they could reflect on any decisions related to those values.
Kind of goes back to the first conversation we had there, didn't it? About the 10 capitals and the different things we might think about, the impact that we're having and the outcomes that we want first, and then work back from that, what kind of a system, and that would include values, people's values, to a discussion about values. But we don't always seem to be able to do that, do we? It's more often some corporation or something, some closed organization decides it wants this, usually to do with the metrics that it is measuring for, return on investment or whatever, and then it creates it. Sorry, go on, Sarah.
I would say it can only be serving, it might be serving just a small portion of the values of the people in the area.
Okay, cool. I mean, that'd be a very different way to approach things, I think, for sure. So post silos, and often we start with a scarcity mindset, don't we? Like, we don't actually start with this question. We start with, well, if you look at healthcare, it always seems to start with, like, we've got this budget, and we've only got this many people, and we've only got this many beds, we've only got this many hospitals, so we'll have to do that. And it doesn't really start like from the other end of kind of what's possible and kind of values, and then work backwards. I think it's a lot of the decisions are driven by kind of scarcity mentality of organizations, that we only have this much money, we only have this much, so forth. And then we kind of narrow down the set of possibilities quite quickly, I think.
Or even for transportation, we think about transportation, not necessarily like the reason we want transportation, to connect with people or to get goods and services or whatever it is. If we started from that initial value, maybe we would design a different system.
Yes, I think when we start to think about outcomes, like we've touched upon that a few times now, and even values, that creates a whole new space for innovation as to how you get there, doesn't it? As opposed to starting with the existing constraints, because it seems like discussions always start within the healthcare. They don't start with what kind of health outcomes we really value or really want, and what kind of system can we design to get there. It kind of starts from the other end. We've only got this much money, or this much whatever, and that kind of narrows. Sorry, start with the problems. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or it starts from like the problem rather from like the ultimate goal would be health, not like how do we deal with heart attacks or whatever, you know.
And I'd say part of it is because we're kind of scared, aren't we? We've got an existing system, and if we ask that question, the kind of question you're asking, you know, around values and outcomes, well, we have to kind of, at least to a certain extent, let go of our assumption that this has to be the system that we're going to use, because you could come up with radically different alternatives, and then, you know, that would disrupt a lot of people, actually, or that would change a lot of things. So I think it's a certain fear about the whole thing.
But this one's not working very well, so.
Sorry, what are you talking about? This one?
Oh, I said a lot of our systems aren't working that well.
Yeah.
So maybe it's time for that.
Yeah, we're getting that. We're getting there, right? Okay, so let's see what else we got down here. Probably just going to do one board today, right? We've got a lot of stuff up here. So nature, this one's around patterns. Systems thinking is a lot around patterns. This idea that someone famously said, systems thinking is about stepping far enough back that you just kind of blur all the details to some extent, and you start to see the patterns in the details instead of just all these little parts. You're able to start to see the dynamics and patterns and so forth, and then design for that, dealing with patterns rather than focusing on the concrete parts of the system. What would that look like in this context? So, what are the dominant resources that we do not see as part of the life cycle? What are the dormant resources? Anybody want to talk on this? The dormant resources we do not see as part of the life cycle. Abstract up, what are all those apparently different events? Things telling us. Yeah. Anybody? Use abstraction. I guess that's kind of what I was saying, right? Abstraction is kind of about stepping back a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah. It's exactly what you just said. Step back enough to blur the details. What is stuff telling us? What are the relationship? I think often in systems we don't let stuff speak to us because we are too much in a rush to make sense of it. So we don't take that step back and let the system talk to us. So yeah.
Yeah. Just stop and listen to what's going on and what's needed. Okay, deriving the general from the specific, not the other way around. Yeah. Anybody? Results from behaviors.
I actually got a plunger thing for it. so that I can actually squeeze and get the stuff out without having to stand with the open box in my hand.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Tony, are you talking about one of these? No. Okay. In harmony with nature, biomimetism, mimicking nature, the patterns that we see in nature. Is that what we're saying here?
I've been watching legacy, by the way. I've been watching legacy. Question.
Behavior and power forces.
I've seen some of it, but without any sound.
Behavior and power forces, present and future, are based on the past, present and future. So these are kind of dynamics over time. These are dynamics over time. Anyone want to talk on this? Present and future are based on the past.
Yeah, I think that patterns are not only about current state. I think also time plays an important factor here, like how can we outreach our understanding in that sense, and thinking that, well, how we want to imagine the future, it's also based on how we lived in the past and we currently live. So, yeah.
Yeah, the idea of path dependence. The decisions we made in the past kind of lock us into certain situations in the present, which will shape the set of possibilities available to us in the future. Okay. Attention.
I wanted to make a question about it.
Yeah.
Actually, I really appreciated the first time I'm making part of this reunion from System of Innovation, and I wanted to use the opportunity to thank you for all the incredible content that you bring to the internet. It's really incredible, the quality of your work. And you were talking about this pattern thing. It seems you were talking about ecologically speaking.
That's how you met me.
And
What's not going to work?
in terms of ecologically thinking, the system and the patterns, and in the system thinking.
Really?
I was just yesterday listening to the interview with Professor David Snowden. He's the author of Canadian Framework. I don't know if you know him, but he was made the question, and he said we should not confuse system thinking with complexity thinking. He was that it's two different approaches. That system thinking, it's much more mathematical, and it tends not to include people in the equation, and that complexity thinking is quite different. You're not thinking about holistically about the whole system, as perhaps we are trying to do now, but you actually think about constraints, disposition states. You think about connections, not units, but about connections and communications, and therefore you are not thinking holistically in the whole system, and therefore we should not confuse system thinking with complex thinking, that according to him is more think ecologically. And I want to know if you agree with him about such interesting distinction. Thank you.
Sorry, I just had bad internet connection there for the last minute. Could you just repeat quickly the kind of key point there? Apologies about that.
No, absolutely, that's totally normal. I will try to because everyone listen to me, so I'll try to make.
So I called the David Snowden part, but go on, yeah.
Yeah, so he was giving his interview, and he said that we could possibly not confuse system thinking, what we're just thinking about the patterns, and pretty much the exercise we are doing here because complexity thinking is different. We should not confuse both, because complexity thinking is think ecologically, is thinking constraints, its position states, and communications and connections between the units and not the units. And they are not thinking about holistically about the system, but specific things. So I wanted to ask you if you agree with him, because he kind of criticizes system thinking, saying that it's a lot mathematical, a lot engineering view of system, tends not to recognize and put people in the equation. It's kind of a critical view about system thinking. And I want to know from you if you agree with him about this distinction between complex system thinking and system thinking. Thank you.
Not fully. There's many different kind of perspectives on systems thinking. There's many different kind of historical threads to it, particularly kind of, people call it soft systems thinking versus hard systems thinking. And I think you're kind of referring to this hard systems thinking thing where they're talking about, systems engineering and information technology and all of this. There's a whole nother dimension to systems thinking, the kind of soft stuff. So I wouldn't totally agree with that. I mean, systems thinking is about a holistic way of looking at the world. That's what it is at its essence. It's a whole paradigm way of looking at the world and relationships between things, and that can be explored in many different ways. Complexity theory is about complexity, which is systems that have evolved to have high degrees of interdependence and interconnectivity in many different parts. So I'd say that's how they differ. Systems thinking is about all understanding all kinds of systems and looking at them in a holistic way, whereas complexity is about understanding complexity, these highly interconnected, interdependent dynamic systems. But I feel like that's another discussion for another day. So let's stay going here. Apologies about my internet connection there. Impact at different scales, time and space. So we're talking about multi-dimensionality. I think this is a key aspect of complex systems, actually, or at least this way of looking at the world. Reductionism by definition is trying to reduce things down. We take something that's complex and we reduce it down to maybe one dimension. Like thinking about consciousness, we try and reduce that down to the neurons and synapses in our brain. This complexity approach, complexity means recognizing the multidimensionality of things, that actually what we experience or the outcomes of a complex system are the function of the interaction between different dimensions. And we try to live with and work with that multidimensional nature of complex systems like cities, all these social and economic and physical dimensions to it. So this is a key aspect. How do we really design for that multidimensionality? So multi-dimensions can mean multiple limited perspectives that need to be brought together. Yes. So a lot of this is about synthesizing. How do you get different kind of perspectives, different dimensions, different ways of looking at it, very different components, and synthesize those into something greater than the sum of the parts, so they don't end up all kind of banging against each other. We get these synergies and we get the emergence of the outcome that we want. So that's really core to the kind of design challenge here. Perspectives, and it starts with that kind of consideration and recognition of those different parts. If we can't kind of bring that into the equation initially, if we're reducing down, excluding some things, going back to our original image here of the city and the way we feel that these things are a bit kind of artificial, because they aren't properly kind of considering their environment. We haven't really been able to bring all those considerations in. We've kind of reduced this thing down and we're not incorporating all those different dimensions to it. And that's part of what we kind of consider. It's part of why we feel a certain artificiality about a lot of the systems we design. I don't actually think it has to be like that. I think that is a function of kind of reductionist approach. I think we can design systems in a very different way. So like water cycle, we learned in science. Like water cycle, we learned in science. Anybody want to talk on this? Perspectives, plural, are essential to dealing with multidimensional problems, which wicked problems are by definition. So we try to understand something not by finding the one person who knows that thing best or the expert. We try to understand them by synthesizing many different perspectives. I think with complex phenomena, there can't really be one right answer. You know, something simple, the weight of a chair, there is one right answer to that. But something very complex, there is no one right answer to it. And I think you have to synthesize many different perspectives. The best answer is one that synthesizes many different perspectives. Balance out. Achieving a balance between these different dimensions and different elements. Is that what we're, who posted this? Someone posted this in Zoom, meta systems. Okay. Meta impact framework. Okay. That's where we started out.
I posted the links into the chat, right? And it's for Meta Integral. So for the English-speaking community here, reach out to the partner, Meta Integral in US, because we do our sessions always in German, right? So,
great. I think there'll be a lot of interest.
So that everyone has it.
Yeah, you might even want to share it in our community site, systemsinnovation.network. I think there's a lot of interest, people in different areas interested in that, economics and so forth. So
yeah, maybe you can guide me a bit on how to, because I'm very new to the whole network here, so System Innovators Network, my very first session here now. So maybe, yeah, if you guide me.
So here's the link. Here's the link, and when you're ready, you can go over there and share, just put a post and share whatever you have. So what networks of interacting systems in multiple dimensions. Yeah, this is important, this networked way of looking at it. And I think ultimately it's kind of the nature of reality when you're dealing with complex systems, that it's actually, they're these multi-layered kind of networks, multi-dimensional networks. And how do we design not just for one of those networks, not just the transport system or the health system or the financial system, all of them separately, but then all of them interconnected and interrelated. I think we start to look at the world like that, you get a real sense of the complexity that we're dealing with when trying to design a whole environment like this. All those overlapping and intersecting networks, and then how they interrelate. So, active listening. Be aware of his single stories. Embrace all perspectives in the room to create insight. That's what we're talking about, you know, synthesizing different perspectives. Active listening. Anybody want to talk on this?
Yeah, that was clean active listening. Really is about, you can only gain multiple perspectives if you are prepared to listen. And it's an incredibly difficult skill to master. So it's just dropping your mental model so that you've got an open mind to what might come, which I find is very often one of the biggest obstacles to actually design a system, maybe in an organization or whatever, that sometimes there is more interest in making your opinion known than in listening to that of others.
Yeah. And I'd say, go on.
Sorry, and I think it's important in this context because it becomes not just about being nice or being caring or being empathetic, but it becomes then instrumental to build a system that responds to multiple needs.
Yeah, I mean, listening, it's just like the foundations of it all, isn't it? I mean, so I think it's the foundations of innovation too. Like we don't use up those two words together very much. You don't hear about those two words put together very much, but I'd say it is, because what are you doing? You're creating a space, aren't you? When you stop and you listen, you're creating a space where something could emerge out of that. You're not saying, okay, I know the answer, I know what it's going to be. You stop and then you listen, and in that you're adapting, you're responding, aren't you? Really, that's what you're doing. You're saying, what's coming in to me, what am I experiencing, and then how should I respond to that, rather than I have the answer, or we've already got a system, or we've only got this many dollars, so we have to do this. This is like adapting. It's like when you listen, I think you're stopping, aren't you, for a minute? You're stopping doing something, you're letting stuff come in. And it could be any kind of listening, right? Like standing in the center of a city and saying, what's going on around here? What's this thing kind of saying to me? And then creating a space. And I think that would be the space for kind of innovation to emerge from this. I think it's very emergent, kind of creating a space or context within which something could emerge and we could adapt and create something quite different. Not really a word we use enough, listening. Really important. Okay, inclusivity at social, cultural, and economic level. Yep. Designs of inquiry, a set of questions. Okay, we've run over time already, so just take a few more of these. Consider the social environment and economic factors. Decentralized but connected. Anybody want to talk on that?
I put that one on there. There's also one underneath that kind of refers to this too, but trying to start at the level of decision making that's needed for the particular thing you're trying to address. The more decentralized, I think, the better, but then not everything can be done at the decentralized level.
Devolution is the word, isn't it? You push it out to the level where the lowest level that you can. Okay, systems inside systems, leveraging tools to support the visualization of hierarchical entities and relational entities. We need better tools for this. Yeah, being able to nest things inside of others and see them at different scales instead of one-off kind of isolated parts. So impact at different scales, time and space. It's expanding we're really talking about expanding, I guess, holism, that's the nature bit. You're always expanding, aren't you? And trying to almost bring in more complexity and deal with more complexity so that you can get something more realistic. Great stuff, guys. I think we have to wrap up now. Our time's up. Really interesting. We didn't quite get as far as we were hoping, right? 3 boards there. Next time, we will stay going and continue on these core kind of principles of systems design. We just talked about holism today, but really good discussion, particularly around accounting for all the different parts and learning how to deal with that complexity and bring it into our designs and then integrate it and create synergies. So those things, because you can get that wrong, right? Bring a whole pile of things in, you can just create a mess, you know? If you go to some cities, you know, Dakar or I don't know, Mexico City or somewhere, and it's just one big kind of jumble of things put together. If you're going to bring all those in, then you're going to have to figure out how to create synergies between them. So very challenging stuff, and great talking to you all on this. And we'll wrap up for now. And yeah, we'll do another one in a month. So I hope to see you all there. I'll keep you posted on the website.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.